The song we just sang really fits with what I want to talk about this morning. Talking about how there's a lot of good things that are good in life, but sometimes things are difficult. That last verse talks about, "Yet when I face the chilling hand of death, where could I go but to the Lord?" And certainly we need to recognize God as our refuge and the one whom we should fear. We need to think and imagine, we're so blessed in this country. We have protections, even though maybe we see the culture shifting a little bit, but we have, freedom of religion and these sorts of things. But, imagine being in true peril and really as a people, thinking maybe our imaginations would go to Nazi Germany or something, and just imagining those people who were taken away into these concentration camps, became death camps, and just a horrible situation that's really unthinkable to our day-to-day life today, or maybe something more modern, like what the situation in Afghanistan where people were trying to evacuate, and some people got trapped in there and trying to escape the difficulties of that, or recently in Iran, where so many people there, tens of thousands of people have been killed just for protesting, people oppressed, or even maybe in more recent years before that, but in recent years where the one child the one child policy in China, where those people were forced to only be allowed to have one child, and they would often choose a son, and a lot of times they would kill their daughter because they needed to get the one son. Just these perverse incentives caused horrible things to go on, and the government would come and force abortions on people, and just things that aren't part of our culture today, that from time to time in history we see go on. And so this morning I want to kind of think about that from a Bible perspective, faith under fire, and really as it's Mother's Day, thinking about this from a perspective of these godly women and women of faith. We wonder about the princess. So that's a reference to Pharaoh's daughter. I'm not sure if she was a woman of faith, but these are all women who resisted the wicked edicts of King Pharaoh. And I think this is a good example for us to think about how our faith ought to be, especially in the face of difficulty. Of course, we think for a moment before we get our bearings there in Exodus. It's the beginning of Exodus is where we'll be looking. But thinking about Genesis and all the things that go through there, toward the end of Genesis, we have the account about Joseph and how his brothers sold him into slavery. He ended up in Egypt, and then through the providence of God, Joseph became kind of in charge, not Pharaoh, but just under Pharaoh, and he was in charge of things there in Egypt. And ultimately, the family moved then to Egypt to be with him in the land of Goshen, which is part of Egypt. And they were favored guests in Egypt because of this influence of Joseph in that. But all that changes, and that's where we see Exodus begin, where those things change. And we'll just pick up in our text here. We're not going to read the very beginning of Exodus, but thinking about how really the end of Genesis 50 really just leads right into Exodus here. But beginning in verse 15, I'll be reading 15 through 2:20 here at the Legacy Standard Bible. It says, Then Joseph died, and all his brothers and all that generation. But the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased and multiplied and became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them. And a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, Behold, the people of the sons of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and it be in the event of war that they also join themselves to those who hate us and fight against us and go up from the land. So they appointed taskmasters over them to afflict them with hard labors, and they built for Pharaoh storage cities, Pithom and Ramses. But the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread out, so that they were in dread of the sons of Israel. So the Egyptians brutally compelled the sons of Israel to slave labor, and they made their lives bitter with hard slave labor in mortar and bricks and in all kinds of slave labor in the field, all their slave labor which they brutally compelled them to do. Then the king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other was named Puah. And he said, "When you are helping the Hebrew women to give birth and see them upon the birth stool, if it is a son, then you shall put him to death. But if it is a daughter, then she shall live." But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt had spoken to them, but let the boys live. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this thing? And let the boys live." Then the midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife can come to them." So God was good to the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very mighty. Now it happened that because the midwives feared God, he made households for them. And Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, "Every son who is born you are to cast into the Nile, and every daughter you are to keep alive." And a man from the house of Levi went and took a daughter of Levi as wife. And the woman conceived and bore a son, and she saw that he was beautiful, so she hid him for 3 months. But she could not hide him any longer. So she took for him an ark of papyrus reeds and covered it over with tar and pitch. Then she put the child into it and put it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. And his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. And the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the Nile, with her young women walking alongside the Nile, and she saw the ark among the reeds, and sent her maidservant, and she took it to her. Then she opened it and saw the child, and behold, the boy was crying. And she had pity on him, and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you?" And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go!" And the girl went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. And the child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. And she named him Moses, and said, "Because I drew him out of the water." Okay, so we have a number of characters to think about here in the situations. So we have, first of all, that change that occurred in the midst of all this. We see that Joseph died, and a number of generations go on here. I think there's a period of 400 years that go on here. But all of those people died, and they don't remember anymore about this. And it says they just keep growing. The children of Israel are growing and become a large number of people there in that area. But then this new king that comes does not know Joseph. And if we think about this new Pharaoh, and there's some debate over the date of when all this occurred, and when the Israelites left Egypt, and when they came in, and all of that. So that all hinges on which dynasty was it. But one theory goes that there was the Hyksos dynasty that was the one that was there when Joseph was there. And that the Hyksos dynasty was actually a group of foreigners who somehow became in charge of Egypt. And they were somehow related. They were Semitic people, like Jewish people are Semitic people. And that sort of explains perhaps how the Pharaoh at that time was somewhat even contemplating having someone like Joseph to be in charge like that. But then the regular Egyptian people were kind of against their leaders because there were these foreign leaders who had come in. But then there was a revolution, and then a different Egyptian dynasty. They're actually native Egyptian people, and that's where this is now, that all these people the generations of Joseph have died off, and they don't know Joseph anymore because they're sort of erasing their history. We're getting rid of that old regime and that old Hyksos dynasty that was doing things against the Egyptian people, this sort of idea. So they don't care about Joseph anymore, even though he saved their country. And so we come to where this new Pharaoh and the new dynasty is against the people of God. And so we see our first threat against them, this threat of slavery, this thing that's against them. We see there in verse 9 and following, we have the sons of Israel were growing more and mightier. They're afraid of them because they keep growing. So let's deal wisely or shrewdly with them. We're going to have taskmasters over them and have them do hard labor. And they're going to build our storage cities for us there in Egypt. So we have them in this slavery that actually gets ramped up here in the next verses, but they're going to do this hard labor in the context of slavery. And this is a threat against the people, a difficulty against the people. Going on there in verse 12, but the more they afflicted them, the more they multiplied, the more they spread out. So there's this constant backfiring we see. Pharaoh keeps trying to hurt the people of God, but the more he tries to do that, the more they grow and become mighty and become more of a threat in his mind, kind of shooting himself in the foot. It says they brutally compelled them. It has all these emphasis of the slave labor and the bitter slave labor. They brutally compelled them. They had to use the mortar and the bricks building these things. And that mortar was probably this pitch and this tar that we see later used in the construction of the ark that Jochebed does. But we have this image in our mind of this horrible treatment. These people are suffering, this brutal labor. Everything backfires, and people are growing. They're mightier, and they're afraid of a slave revolt, basically. There's no indication that the people of Israel are actually plotting such a thing, but they're afraid because of that whole revolution that maybe is in the background of all of this. They're worried that the people are motivated to revolt. And so since it's backfiring, what are they going to do? Well, they're going to start killing people. So we're going to secretly kill the baby boys. This is the second threat here now. We have there in verse 15, we have these Hebrew midwives named Shiphrah and Puah. And these names are named for a reason, to honor these women, these good women of faith, courageous faith. Now, Shiphrah's name means something like dawn, like the dawn of the morning, or fair. These ideas of beautiful, we might say. And Puah similarly means fragrant, splendid. These beautiful ideas that these women's names mean, and they are beautiful characters in what they do. Because the Pharaoh tells them, hey, when you're helping these Hebrew women, because they're going to give birth, the midwife, sort of like a physician or a doula. We have some roles like that today where women will help other women with their birth, but this was the primary way this was done back then. And when you're helping them, if you see that it's a boy, if it's a son, kill him, kind of like secretly, because you're sort of in charge. They're vulnerable, and you're helping with that birth, and you're in a position where you can kill that child. And that's what you should do. You should kill that son so that the Hebrews don't have any new sons being born into their population. But if it's a daughter, then she can live. That's okay. That's interesting that Pharaoh is not even given a name in this narrative. That these women are honored, these names. But Pharaoh is just a job title. He's just the king. He's not given a name. But we see as Pharaoh's telling these women what to do, to kill these children, kind of in our mind should echo to we see later in the Gospels where Herod is trying to kill the baby boys to try to kill Jesus. But it's interesting in this narrative, He says, well, let the daughters live. There's this implication, well, the daughters aren't a threat. But this whole story is about these women, these daughters who orchestrate the destruction of Egypt. And he doesn't even realize that. Because he's telling them to kill these boys, but they're not going to do it. These women are rebelling against the wicked king and spelling the doom for Egypt in the long run. So we see the first heroines here in our story, Shiphrah and Puah, giving this resistance here in verse 17. But the midwives feared God, and that's the key, isn't it? We need to fear God and follow him. There's good reason to fear Pharaoh. He could kill you, but from an eternal perspective, from a godly big view perspective, fearing God is more important. We should fear him who can destroy our soul in hell, as opposed to just those who can take our life. But the midwives feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt had spoken to them, but let the boys live. So we see this righteous rebellion in these two women. It sort of should make us think of in the New Testament, where we see, for instance, in Acts chapter 5, verse 29, where Peter and the apostles were teaching about Jesus there in the early church. And the Sanhedrin, Jewish authorities, were telling them, hey, don't do that. We're going to beat you up and don't teach about Jesus anymore. But then in Acts 5:29, but Peter and the apostles answered and said, we must obey God rather than men. And that takes courage to say that. People who can beat you up and people who can kill you. But we need to recognize the fear of God is more important than the fear of even a leader like this, especially a wicked leader. Verse 18, so the king of Egypt called for the midwives. Hey, we're going to have an accounting for this. Why have you done this thing and let the boys live? Why didn't you do what I said? Then the midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not as the Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwife can come to them. Of course, Pharaoh's perspective is probably, as a king in the courts and the palace, he's with women who are probably at leisure. Imagine on the bed with the palm frond and someone feeding them grapes. And this is perhaps his perspective of women. But these Hebrew women are, they're slaves and they're laboring and they're tough and they're very busy. So this is sort of the explanation they give. These Hebrew women are tough. Now, this is going to be a terrifying encounter for these women who fear God, but they also recognize they're before Pharaoh, who could kill them. And they tell Pharaoh this this explanation. Now, we might wonder, did they lie to Pharaoh? I mean, I'm sure the Hebrew women are tougher, but they didn't do what Pharaoh said. And they're sort of giving this explanation. It's kind of like, again, back to the Nazi perspective, the diary of Anne Frank and how different people were hiding in people's homes. They're trying to hide these Jewish people that were going to be killed by the government. And the government comes to the door and they say, where are the Jews? And you say, there are no Jews here. You're lying to them, but you're saving the people who they would murder. So there's some debate about, is this like that? Or did the people learn that, hey, don't call Puah and Shiphrah because they've been ordered to kill the children. So just take care of it yourself so that they can have plausible deniability to be able to say this. Whatever it is that they did, they were successful in this and God was pleased. So we see in verse 20. So God was good to the midwives. He blessed them. The people multiplied and became mighty. So the people of Israel, again, it's all backfiring. They're growing more and more. Now it happened that because the midwives feared God, they obeyed him. They didn't do this wicked thing that Pharaoh ordered them to do. He made households for them. Now these midwives were typically employed from women who weren't married for whatever reason. Maybe we might negatively say old maids or something. Someone that wasn't able to get married for some reason, or maybe widows. Whatever it is, they were now blessed to be able to be married and have children. They're not barren anymore, if that's what it was. They're blessed by God through their faith, through their faithful obedience. And so we need to make sure we're honoring women of faith. We need women of courageous faith. We need mothers. These women ultimately became mothers. They had households for them. And as we think about Mother's Day, it's good to think about these biblical women who did such courageous faith. But it escalates further here. We have the third threat. Well, we can't get the midwives to do it secretly. So let's do it openly. Cast the baby boys in the Nile. We're not going to hide it and be sneaky anymore, because that didn't work. It says, verse 22, and Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, every son who is born you are to cast into the Nile, and every daughter you are to keep alive. Again, these daughters are not looked at as a threat, right? Keep saying that. Keep the daughters alive. It's fine. Every son cast into the Nile. So we kind of get this idea of a decree. This goes out here, kill the boys. And all the dangers you might think of casting a baby into the Nile. The water itself, you could drown. The coldness. Crocodiles is what we usually think about. And there's hippos. We often think of those as cute animals with the big mouth, but those are actually some of the most deadly animals, even today. I think there's more people get killed from hippos than a lot of these other animals out there. But they're recruiting all the Egyptians to do this. All the people are to do this. So we're going to have everybody, all the Egyptian people, enforcing this now. So we have entering into our story now a second heroine. Jochebed or Jochebed, depending how you pronounce that. Here in chapter 2 now, verse 1. And a man from the house of Levi went and took a daughter of Levi as a wife. Now, the names aren't mentioned there, but we look at the genealogy later in chapter 6, Exodus 6, verse 20. We see Amram is the father here, and Jochebed is the mother of Aaron and Moses, as it goes on to say in Exodus 6:20. But her name, talking about their names, because Pharaoh's not given a name, but this name Jochebed or Jochebed, it means something like Yahweh or the Lord is glory, or glory to the Lord, something like that. And so it's a name that praises God, and we see her in her actions praising God. Exodus 2, verse 2. And the woman, Jochebed, conceived and bore a son. And we know the son ultimately is Moses. He's not named yet. And she saw that he was beautiful. So she hid him for 3 months. So imagine this woman in the threat of the government to come and kill her son, hiding him. Working through this, Imagine how hard that was. It only got harder as he grew and got stronger and cried more. All these things that we know go on with having babies. And it says in the text that he is beautiful, the way I read it. Your translation might say goodly. The King James Version says goodly or something like that. He's beautiful, he's fair, he was fine, he was special. This is that word used so much in Genesis 1 in creation. The word is tov, and it means just basically good. We see the light was good when God created light. The land and the water was good, and the plants were good. The lights in the heavens, the sun and the moon and the stars were good, and the animals were good. And then the sixth day, when he saw all that he had done, it was very good. And so perhaps we're supposed to think of that when we think about how Moses was said to be good. He's a good baby. He was good. Moses was good, just like the creation was good. And he's worth value. He has value, just like any baby, of course, is today. But there's something special about him. Verse 3. So she could not hide him any longer, of course. Baby growing up. She took for him an ark of papyrus reeds and covered it over with tar and pitch. Then she put the child into it and put it among the reeds on the bank of the Nile. So Imagine her using that mortar that they would use in their construction projects, this tar, and putting it over this, essentially this basket material, making it into an ark or a box to put him in. And imagine the turmoil she felt, and what am I going to do with this baby? And what am I going to do now that he's growing up? Is he going to live? And it seems like perhaps she looks backward to God's word, to the account of Noah and the ark. This is the same word actually that's used. We're talking about Noah's ark. We talk about Moses being in the ark of bulrushes or whatever we call this basket material he was made out of. That's the only time that this word is used, is to describe this little box that Moses was put in, and then Noah's ark. Now, when we think the Ark of the Covenant, that's actually a different Hebrew word. Noah's ark and Moses' ark are the two that seem to go together, and they're both covered with pitch. There are parallels to it. It saves them, right? We see these foreshadowing of these things connected together. We also see the reeds that it's made of and that she puts him in. Seems to be a connection to later Moses leading the people through the Red Sea to salvation. Literally, the Red Sea is called in the Old Testament the Sea of Reeds. And so he's put in the reeds and then leads them out through the Sea of Reeds. Seems to be a connection as well. And it's also interesting to think of the irony here, where back in Exodus 1, verse 22, Pharaoh commanded all his people, saying, "Every son who is born you are to cast into the Nile." And that's what she does. She casts him into the Nile. Now, in this ark to take care of him. She actually obeys the king, but with a twist in this ark. And she shows great godly courage. And we need godly mothers, of course, today, who love God and love their children. We need women like Shifra and Pua who aren't killing babies. We need people to stand for life, especially that is the thing in our culture. There's so much abortion that goes on and devaluing of life, even with things like assisted suicide and these sorts of things. We shouldn't be a part of that. We need women who love their children and are self-sacrificial for them, as we see Jochebed was here for Moses. And then we see a third heroine. Moses' sister, Jochebed's daughter, Miriam. Her name's not mentioned here, but we understand that's the sister that later is with him in adulthood. Her name means something like, there's actually good and bad definitions of her name I saw, but some of the pleasant ones were like, the one who is wished for, one who is loved. Seems to be the idea. But here in verse 4, his sister stood at a distance to know what would be done to him. She didn't know what was going to happen. Am I going to watch him get eaten by an animal? Or soldiers going to come and stab spears into him? But she's watching to see what's going to happen. It's terrifying to see what might happen. But, of course, God's hand is in all of this. And as she's waiting there to see what would happen, we see what happens is that there's this princess that comes into the situation, Pharaoh's daughter, and she seems to show some resistance to the wickedness of Pharaoh, her father's plans as well. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the Nile with her young women walking alongside her. She has all these servants with her. And they saw the ark. She saw the ark among the reeds and have her servants go get this, go fetch this. And she opened it and saw the child. She saw little baby Moses. And behold, the boy was crying. Of course, that's the problem. It's becoming a problem to keep this child hidden anymore. So he's crying and he's been alone in this little basket. And she had pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." So she realized, this is one of those little boys who my dad said needs to be killed. Needs to be cast into the Nile. Of course, he had been cast into the Nile. Maybe she saw that as sort of like the workaround. Well, he's cast into the Nile, so it's okay. We aren't really told a lot about Pharaoh's daughter, and really we don't know exactly what's going on in her mind, but she had pity on this baby, and she knew it was a Hebrew child. She wasn't agreeing with her father's wicked plan, it seems, and she adopts this baby and it seems to be perhaps some righteous rebellion on her part. But back to Miriam again in verse 7. Then his sister Miriam said to Pharaoh's daughter, because she's right there watching what's going on, she's poised. I see that what's going on here. I'm going to intervene and pivot here. Shall I call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women? I know a Hebrew woman who could help out here. It's kind of in the background. That she may nurse the child for you. And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go. So the child went and called the child's mother. So it's kind of like we see God's hand in that, of course. Her sister is able to go and approach the daughter of the wicked king and get really the family back together, at least for a short time. So we need even wise young women. Miriam at this point isn't a mother, but we need wise young women with godly courage to fear God and show this sort of courageous faith. So we see then, as it goes on, Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. So the woman, the mother, Jochebed, took the child and nursed him. And the child grew, and there's not a detail here, but probably 2 or 3 years is what was typical back then, or before a child would be weaned. So Moses had his mother to help him, at least in that early childhood, to learn about who he was and his place with the people of God and this sort of thing, and have a relationship which hopefully continued on. We don't have a lot of details about that, but it says, then she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So that's sort of the changeover now. Now she's not with Jacob. Moses is not with his mother every day, or maybe at all. We don't know. But she, Pharaoh's daughter, named him Moses and said, because I drew him out of the water. And Moses and drew are sort of the play on words here. Moses is Moshe, and draw is Masha. So there's sort of this play on words to kind of name him. Since I drew him out of the water, I'll name him after that idea. Some of the same consonants in the word in Hebrew. So we think about this Hebrew princess, or this Pharaoh's daughter, Egyptian princess, paying the mother of Moses to do these things, take care of her own son. It's almost a resurrection idea that's implicit in all of this. Casting her son into the water like this, kind of expecting death, hoping for something good, and which ultimately happened, but the waters sort of represent death. We talk about that in baptism too, and we're to be buried with him in a death like his, so that we can rise to walk in newness of life. And Moses went into those waters of death where all of those dangers were there, but then he was resurrected, so to speak, and actually brought back even to the family. What a blessing that is, that we certainly have in Christ. So it's not clear that this princess was faithful to the Lord or had any idea about that. God used her, maybe is one way to say that. But she seems to be against the satanic death of these baby boys, and that's a good thing. We need more people to have that mindset, to not be for death, but be for life, as we even think today as it relates to the abortion issue. But notice how God's plans thwart the satanic plans of Pharaoh at every turn here. You had, these people are growing, so let's enslave them to, keep them down. And as they were enslaved, the people grew. It made the problem worse from his perspective. So we'll kill the babies. We'll do it secretly to not have people rise up. But then those midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, resisted, and the people grew. And so, we won't hide it anymore. We're going to order that all the baby boys be cast into the Nile. And we see, seems to be the case that happened to a great degree, but Jochebed, this faithful woman, resisted that and sort of twisted that order to, yes, he was cast into the Nile in a protective ark and then was saved. And so as Moses was adrift And before he's saved, we're thinking, well, what's going to happen? Miriam was able to pivot that to be able to bring the family back into it. And so we have this homeless baby Moses. He's a homeless Hebrew, and the princess, Pharaoh's own daughter, adopted him. And of course, all that leads in the bigger picture of Exodus to the destruction of Egypt. So what a blessing to have these examples of these godly women who resisted this wickedness and feared God. So we'll leave you with this verse from Exodus 1:17. But the midwives feared God. Even though they had plenty to fear in Pharaoh, they feared God and did not do as the king of Egypt had spoken to them, but let the boys live. So do you fear God today? And do you have a courageous faith over that fear? We think about Moses and how he relates to the greater prophet to come, which we know is fulfilled in Jesus Christ. And just like the wickedness of that generation, as Peter said in Acts 2, we're to be saved from this crooked generation, even today. We need to take a stand today for these things. The song we're going to sing is 557, What Will Your Answer Be? Are you washed in the blood of the crucified one? What will your answer be? He will your answer be, is what it says there. We hope that Jesus is your answer today. If we can help you in any way to obey the gospel or to get right with God, we invite you to come as we stand and sing the song.